Well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to have everybody back. This is the second last panel discussion for the semester, so we were reflecting on that a little bit. We'll give you an update on how the rest of the semester will go, including what the topic for next week's panel will be. Colin, did you want to give an update on the seminar situation?
Sure. We have two more seminars, and of course this Friday is Good Friday, so we won't have one this Friday for those folks in the Friday seminars, but you will have, of course, next Friday and also next week for everybody. And then the final seminar for the Friday folks is on Monday, April the 12th. And so for those seminars that you're attending after the panel discussion, where you don't have an assignment due, it's kind of an open-ended, you can talk about your final projects or chat about any of the course content. And
Leo too.
Leo too. And do attend your, even if you have all your participation marks, do please attend the seminars to keep that conversation going. I know everybody who's here is probably attending the seminars because you're the folks who are attending. So that's great. Also, make sure to fill out your student feedback questionnaire. We really love to receive these. We don't get a huge number back, and so we want to see them. Maybe 15, 20%, but maybe we can bring that up a little higher. Let's bring the number up a little higher. Fill out the student feedback questionnaires. We really want to hear your comments, and it's a new course, it's a new design, so we'd like to hear from you. I think they open tomorrow, and then they're open until April 14th. So that's all I have.
I think so. For the alumni, we'll probably be having some kind of a mechanism for you to provide feedback as well. We'll talk with Annie about that, but we also would like to hear from alumni about their experience in the course and what they thought as well. Again, having this mixture of students and alumni is also a new aspect, so we're definitely interested to hear how that's going from your perspective.
Yeah, and for Catalan, you said, so the seminars, Colin explained, but the panel next week, we have a lineup for next week. So at the end, just like as usual, we always mention the panel for next week. So we'll mention the panel for next week at the end, but it's going to be, oh, I forgot the title.
We'll mention, you'll see there's a whole slide and everything.
Yeah, we made a slide.
So as usual, we'll have the questions for the panelists and questions regarding the topic for tonight in the Zoom chat. Any other discussions that you want to engage in, you can certainly do in another forum, such as on CourseLink or in some of the chat groups that have been set up or in your seminars. We will, as always, do our best to incorporate as many of the questions as we can. Often we get interested in something that we end up kind of wanting to ask from our own perspective as well, and sometimes we collate the questions into a single kind of one, but they're always very inspirational. And sometimes the questions that show up in the chat, even if they don't make their way into a question that we ask for the panel, we do go through some of those again when thinking about the weekly assignment and those sorts of things. So it is useful to share your questions regardless. Colin, do you want to move on to the next one? And so this is all you, Sophie.
Perfect. Well, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest panelists tonight, and we'll start with presentations as usual. And first, we'll start with Ajay Heble, who is a professor in the School of English and Theater Studies and the founding director of the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation, which began with a major collaborative research initiative, SHIRT grant, in 2007. And the SHIRT grant was to direct a large-scale, multi-institutional and interdisciplinary research project to study the social implications of improvised musical practices and foster innovative partnerships with community partners. In 2013, a large seven-year partnership grant allowed Dr. Heble and his team to create the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation. Dr. Heble is the author of 15 books and numerous articles on a range of topics in arts and humanities, and the founding co-editor of the peer-reviewed journal Critical Studies in Improvisation, études critiques en improvisation. So rare, c'est tellement rare que je peux parler en français dans ce cours-ci. For 23 years, before retiring in 2016, Dr. Heble was also the artistic director of the award-winning Guelph Jazz Festival and Colloquium, which he also founded. And during the pandemic in August 2020, Dr. Heble and the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation launched a 24-hour online multidisciplinary improvisation festival called IF Improvisation Festival. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Ajay.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Sophie and team. I'm happy to be here. I have no slides to show. I'm just going to talk. So I'm going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. So in an article published almost a year ago, shortly after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, author and activist Arundhati Roy explains how historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one, she says, is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Music, too, I believe, has long been an important catalyst for imagining and indeed often enacting new ways of living together in the world. Social theorist Jacques Attali, for instance, famously wrote in his book Noise about music's ability to foreshadow what he called new relations among people. Amidst the unprecedented global challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, music has certainly offered us some inspirational lessons about resourcefulness, resilience, and hope. Working without a written score or script, improvising musicians in particular have shown us throughout the pandemic, as they've shown us before, how they can use the resources at hand to envision and enact something new, sometimes in even the most challenging circumstances. Since the first lockdowns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, arts organizations and musicians around the world have demonstrated the effectiveness of improvisational responses, creatively using public spaces and the digital sphere to connect artists with their communities in profoundly moving ways. During this time when concerts and festivals have been canceled, when the ability of musicians to earn a living wage has been severely diminished, so many musicians and arts organizers have responded in creative ways that encourage us to imagine the world anew. From opera singers on their balconies, serenading quarantined communities in Italy, to drive-in concerts in Denmark, to a worldwide sonic meditation via video call inspired by the life work of the great improvising musician Pauline Oliveros, to a program in Houston, Texas, where you can schedule an improvising musician to perform a 10-minute piece of experimental music from a safe distance in front of your home, to a 24-hour online event called Pansodia, organized by the University of Padua in Italy and held as part of UNESCO International Jazz Day, to a 24-hour online improvisation festival, UNIV2020, that Sophie mentioned, that I helped to organize last August through my institute. There's no shortage of inspiring artists who've been finding ways to share the power of music to bring people together during this difficult time. The article that I've offered as a suggested reading for the course is partly about lessons we learned from doing our own online festival, UNIV2020. There is, I believe, much we can learn from these sorts of musical examples. Indeed, recent international crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic and protests against racialized violence, have made very clear the vital need for improvisation in our current moment. We're seeing perhaps now more than ever how individuals and communities must adapt, how they must adapt to unprecedented situations, how they must build new ways of communicating with and relating to one another, how they must, again invoking Arundhati Roy, find ways to imagine the world anew. We've seen how the participatory and civic virtues of engagement, dialogue, respect, and community building that get inculcated through improvised musical practices, how these sorts of virtues, engagement, dialogue, respect, community building, have taken on a particular urgency during this time. Through real-time creative decision-making, risk-taking, and collaboration, which are of course some of the central tenets of improvisation as both a musical and a social practice, creative decision-making, risk-taking, and collaboration. Through these things, I believe that we can respond to this call to action we can interrogate unquestioned assumptions, discover new ontologies, and operationalize potential solutions to some of the most pressing contemporary global challenges and emergencies. In her book, Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities, Rebecca Solnit suggests, and I'm quoting, that hope is not about what we expect, it's an embrace of the essential unknowability of the world, of the breaks with the present, the surprises. What might it mean, I wonder, to embrace the essential unknowability of the world during the unprecedented times in which we are living? Where can we find resources for hope during such dark times of crisis and emergency? Might the current moment, I want to ask, prompt us to imagine and to improvise more just, empowering, resilient, and equitable futures? Again, thinking back to that comment from Arundhati Roy, imagining the world anew. Can we use the pandemic to imagine the world anew? Well, where might that take us? Earlier in that book, Hope in the Dark, Solnit, interestingly, makes a passing but very telling reference to music, riffing on Cornel West's claim in his book, Race Matters, where he says that jazz is not so much a term for a musical art form, but for a mode of being in the world, an improvisational mode of protein, fluid, and flexible disposition toward reality, suspicious of either or viewpoints. Now, the idea that improvisation as both a vital creative practice and a mode of being in the world might have significant lessons for us as we respond to and think our way out of the COVID-19 crisis is explored throughout a recently published special issue, the first of 2 volumes, on improvisation musical communities in COVID-19 in the journal that Sophie mentioned, Critical Studies in Improvisation. In their introduction to that first volume, the guest editors of the special issue, my colleague Daniel Fishlin, as well as Laura Risk and Jesse Stewart, suggest that to play music, and particularly to improvise, is to engage with states of ongoing precarity. How exactly the next note will sound, or even what it may be, is unknown, right? When you're thinking about improvised music, you don't know what the next note is going to be until it's not. And the following note is what hangs on the knife edge. The resilience of improvisational musicians of all kinds in the face of the pandemic, they argue, points to their disciplined acquaintance with creating on that edge. They continue, while the wreckage from the pandemic is obvious, the resilience of the most fragile forms of the musical socius presents remarkable examples of survival. Many of the tactics deployed by venues, performers, and community organizers are deeply connected with the improvisatory forms of practice found in the music they host, perform, and or use for wider projects of social engagement. Now, it's important to note that the role improvisation and improvisational practices have played in emergency response has been documented and indeed lauded long before the COVID-19 pandemic was declared. In one of her other books, called A Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit writes about the profound sense of hope that has emerged out of the extraordinary communities and improvised responses found in emergency situations of disaster and devastation, such as those in post-Katrina New Orleans. She references the work of disaster expert and sociologist Kathleen Tierney, director of the University of Colorado's Natural Hazards Center from 2003 to 2016. Tierney argues that improvisation is a distinct capacity that people employ to manage risk. Decades of studying disaster have, she says, made me far more interested in people's own capacity for self-organizing and for improvising. You come to realize that people often do best when they're not following a script or a score, but when they're improvising and coming up with new riffs. And I see this tremendous creativity in disaster responses, both on the part of community residents and on the part of good emergency personnel. Seeing them become more flexible, seeing them break rules, seeing them use their ingenuity in the moment to help restore the community and to protect life, human life, and care for victims. It is when people deviate from the script that exciting things happen. That's the end of the quote. One of the key things I take from those comments from Kathleen Tierney is how improvisation shows us that there are other ways of doing things, that another world is possible when you let go of the script. Suggesting that disaster might provide us with a view into another world for our other selves. Solnit, in that book, A Paradise Built in Hell, is interested in how people step up to meet the needs of the moment, how they improvise communities in emergency situations, and how such acts can, in her words, offer a glimpse of who else we ourselves may be and what else our society could become. Right, again, think back to Arundhati Roy, Imagining the World Anew. Solnit's making a very similar claim here. She explains knowing how people behave in disasters is fundamental to knowing how to prepare for them, and what can be learned about resilience, social and psychological response, and possibility from sudden disasters is relevant as well for the slower disasters of poverty, economic upheaval, and incremental environmental degradation, as well as the abiding questions about social possibilities. So, consider some of the claims I've been presenting to you today. Abiding questions about social possibilities, embracing surprise and the unknown, imagining the world anew, a glimpse of who else we might be and what else we could become, creating on the edge. How, I wonder, might we use these assertions as prompts, as cues, to think through the ways in which the COVID-19 emergency has shown us that the ability to improvise, to respond and adapt to unforeseen circumstances has never been more important. One of our central arguments throughout the work I've been doing with the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation is that musical improvisation is more than just a form of artistic practice. Sure, it's about that, but I believe it's about much more. Indeed, I believe that it has much to teach us about social and societal improvisation, about the ways in which we listen to and interact with one another across various forms of difference in various contexts and situations. Improvisation, in short, offers vital strategies for managing and responding to change. So where, to invoke the title of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1967 book, where will we go from here? What might a post-pandemic look like? And in what ways might improvisation figure in our efforts to imagine the world anew? My invocation of Dr. King is, I believe, relevant for a number of reasons. It's meant as a deliberate cue for us to recall the parallel pandemic of racial injustice and systemic anti-Black racism that's captured the world's attention during the last year, especially as a result of the murder of George Floyd. It also should prompt us to consider that those who've been most adversely and disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 emergency have been aggrieved communities and people of color. Emergency, as I think the pandemic has made very clear, does have a color. In such a context, it's worth recalling that improvisation, at least in music, might also be said to have a color. In many ways, and for many creative musicians, it's the color of resistance and activism. Think of the long, important, and illustrious history of improvisation in the context of aggrieved peoples, and I'm thinking in particular of African-American jazz artists sounding off against systems of fixity and oppression. These are artists who are able to use the resources at hand in the arenas available to them in order to make positive things transpire and to create something new that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Artists, in short, who made a way out of no way. Improvisation for these African-American artists was an expression both of unspoken, erased, or whitewashed Black histories and of unwritten, unscripted futures. It was part of Black music's resistance to capture and fixity, part of a refusal to give in to the culture of acquiescence or non-participation that resigns itself to the way things are because, or so we are too often told, no other future is possible. I firmly believe that improvisation can teach us otherwise. In the context of African American creative practice, improvisation teaches us, again, to imagine the world anew. So to conclude, there is no doubt that we live in challenging times, but challenges can, as so many artists in the history of jazz and improvised music have made so clear, challenges can lead to opportunities, to lessons about how we might live our lives differently. In challenging us to adapt to unprecedented circumstances, the current moment has clearly offered us a call to action. Imagining the world anew is no easy task. It's not always comfortable to let go of what we know and expect, to abandon the tried and true, or to trade the pleasures of certitude and fixity for the surprises that come from ways of knowing and ways of being that cannot readily be accommodated within received frameworks of assumption. How we respond to this call to action may be one of the most urgent predicaments confronting us today. If there's ever been a moment in our history that demands improvisation, surely we are living it. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ajay. It was super interesting to hear as a department chair, having to manage a lot of the pandemic this year, and really so much of it, anyway, we'll pick it up in the questions periods, but so much of it really resonated with me. My text is on the wrong side. Okay, we'll introduce, sorry, wait, I have to improvise. My text doesn't want to collaborate with me. Okay, sorry, thank you. So we'll go to our next speaker tonight, and then we'll do the question period after. So Dr. Carla Rice is a professor in the Department of Family Relations and Applied Nutrition and a Canada Research Chair at the University of Guelph. Dr. Rice specializes in subjectivity and embodiment studies and art and story-based methodologies. She has founded Revision, the Center for Art and Social Justice, as a creative research hub with a mandate to foster social well-being, equity, and justice. Dr. Rice is currently principal investigator of Bodies in Translation, Activist Art, Technology, and Access to Life, which is a SSHRC-funded partnership grant that seeks to cultivate disability arts and culture at an ever-expanding network of community and institutional partners. She has received awards for research, teaching, and mentorship, and has researched and written on a diversity of social justice topics, ranging from understanding and responding to women's food and body issues and decolonizing settler subjectivities, to developing affirmative understandings of disability and mind-body difference, and cultivating accessible arts and cultural practices, both off and online. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Carla. Oh, you're on mute still.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say thank you to you, Sophie, and Ryan for inviting Ajay and I to speak tonight. And I want to thank you for that generous introduction. And I'm actually going to start my talk with a land acknowledgement, which I've, sort of gotten into the habit of doing and really appreciate how it brings me back to the earth and it grounds me. Over the past few decades, as settlers have begun to reckon with Canada's colonial violence, many people have taken up this practice of opening events or opening their talks with a land acknowledgement. Basically, a land acknowledgement is a statement, as we all know, that recognizes the original peoples on whose territories we gather and we occupy. On the screen, you see an artistic rendering of Canada that maps the territories, the traditional territories of Indigenous people who've lived on these lands and in intimate relations with these lands for over a millennia. The map was created by disability identified Indigenous artist Vanessa Dion Fletcher. who does a lot of work with the Revision Center. Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, or the landmass that we currently call North America, develop complex systems of living premised on relationality and animacy, or a belief in the interconnectedness and aliveness of all things. Theater scholar Dylan Robinson, and Dylan is Coastal Salish, Wemhook, and the Wemhook are traditional territories are on the in BC on the Pacific coast. Robinson argues that from an Indigenous perspective, land acknowledgements are always relational, meaning that they're not just bureaucratic statements. Land acknowledgements are not etiquette, they're not ceremonial, they're not, sort of, and shouldn't be kind of these canned responses to, Canada's reckoning with our colonial history and legacies. But rather, he argues, land acknowledgements are acts. They are acts that require us as speakers to center our relationships with and our responsibilities to the human and non-human world in the specific context of this moment. So it's about me entering into relationship with you. That is the purpose of the land acknowledgement, and me situating myself in relationship to you. So following Robinson, I want to honor and pay respects to the people of the Three Fires Confederacy, on whose ancestral territories I learn and I work. And I'm speaking with you today from Takaranto, which is an Indigenous term for the city of Toronto, which I want to acknowledge was built without meaningful compensation on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are members of the Three Fires Confederacy. And tonight too, I want to recognize that we all have internet access, that you are coming and meeting me, and I'm coming and meeting you in this virtual space that we are inhabiting together, that we're creating together. And that many Indigenous communities do not have equal access to the bandwidth that we might have. Let alone not having access to clean water or safe housing. They remain underserved by our governments, that in distributing the bulk of the wealth that has been generated from the land and the resources of our country to settler communities. And that is what gives us access to, and me access to, the work that I'm going to discuss today. So, as Sophie mentioned, I am the academic director of the Revision Center for Art and Social Justice, and we are a center at the University of Guelph. We do research creation and engage in arts-informed research methods. We hold a number of research grants that are on the left side of the slide. There are too many for me to go through, but I show this organogram to really give you a sense of the scope of our work, but also to, sort of maybe bring you a little bit closer to what it felt like last March when the lockdown was declared. We had many projects ongoing and had to pivot immediately to figure out how we were going to deliver and, sort of organize and undertake the work of the center. And this evening, I want to reflect on Revision's move to the online space in COVID's wake. I want to outline some of the adaptations we've made to our art making, storytelling, and video making methods, and how we've oriented to these as a way to sustain our research, but more importantly, our community during the pandemic. COVID obviously has generated powerful, often contradictory emotions in people. And I'm going to speak to those and show some of the videos made by University of Guelph faculty and students who participated in our online workshops. And I think that these videos give some clues about the sources and the effects of some of these intense, contradictory emotions that people have been feeling. I'm going to make the argument for staying with these contradictory emotions, the spiking and troughing of emotion that many people have cycled through during this period of time, in order to better understand the conditions that generated them. And I'm going to also reflect for a few minutes and ask you to think with me for a few minutes to call into question whether the push for resilience is necessarily positive. Is the ability to bounce back always a good thing? I want to now make an audio description note about my slides. I'll describe the text slides now, and then I'll describe the image slides and the image scapes of the videos before I show them. The background of each text slide is in one of 4 primary vibrant colors: red, green, orange, or blue, and they contain keywords and quotes that I refer to in my talk. And the reason why I do audio description is because this is a disability cultural practice, and it's one that I embrace as part of my commitment to disability arts and culture. And as part of this practice, in disability arts spaces and cultural spaces, we also describe ourselves for people who can't see us. So I am a middle-aged woman, and I have hair that is both white and blonde. And I'm white, I'm queer, I'm cisgendered, and I have a roundish body. And I think, oh, and I'm wearing a gray jacket. So that is the kind of description that people would give in a disability arts and culture space. In early 2020, as COVID-19 cases surged, Aisha Ahmed wrote, "The legacy of this pandemic will live with us for years, perhaps decades to come. It will change the way we move, build, learn, and connect. There is simply no way that our lives will resume as if this had never happened." So the pandemic, as Ajay has beautifully sort of gestured toward in his own talk, has exposed the pre-existing inequalities and environmental crises brought on by Western lifeways, even as Indigenous resurgence, Black Lives Matter, and other social change movements have contested loudly these conditions. In this critical moment marked by uncertainty, fear, and despair, at Revision, we knew we needed to stretch our story work beyond the typical in-person methods of artistic creation that we engaged in prior to the pandemic. We saw the development of accessible digital storytelling methods as a critical move in advancing the new collectivities, new narratives, and new activisms that have been emerging and coalescing under pandemic conditions. We knew we needed a platform for marginalized and misrepresented communities, for justice-seeking communities, to tell their stories, and tell their stories with a purpose. So part of the storytelling work that I have witnessed and participated in over the past year has had an important intention behind it. And that is one of amplifying people's voices so that we can help to reshape the new normal, the world to be. So at Revision, we typically run our workshops in person, as I mentioned. When the lockdown began, we had planes, trains, and automobiles booked. We were running workshops across Canada. We were running workshops in the UK. And we had to cancel everything and rethink what we were doing. We wondered whether and how we could create an accessible online research space that would allow us to continue our work. And so we took the month of April to basically pilot such an online space. We brought all folks who were affiliated with Revision together, and people experimented with how we would create this space. Like, how could we engage in participatory art making online? How could we make films together online in the digital space? How could we make art together and at the same time build community in the digital space? So together we created an online storytelling workshop infrastructure anchored by a website space that you see here, with live sessions. So we had artists and filmmakers and video editors developing tutorials, and so doing live teaching around how to shoot film in your home, how to use your iPhone to generate really good images. We had creative writing workshops. We also invested in software that allowed us to edit film, so that people who were participating in our workshops could edit a film, the film they were working on, at the same time that Revision staff would edit the film. So the staff could go in from the back end and support the person in learning the software and learning how to edit their film and work with them. And we have run now numerous online story making sessions for groups across the country and beyond. We've had story making sessions on restoring autism, on episodic disability, on decolonizing education, decolonizing our journeys, so focusing on settler subjectivities, settler selves, and how we begin to decolonize ourselves. And other workshops. So a whole range of workshops we've now run online. So storytellers, so we invited into those early sort of pilot workshops, storytellers who were Revision affiliated faculty who were wanting to run their own workshops with us. And so we made them the guinea pigs and said, okay, guys, if you want to run your workshops with us, then come and join this experimenters workshop and we'll kind of figure out together what we're doing. And then we ran another pilot with first year University of Guelph students who signed up for a first year seminar on digital storytelling. We knew that we had to orient to the emotion-filled atmosphere of pandemic conditions, when people were experiencing disruption in their plans and routines, when their anxiety, fatigue, and despair were escalating, when they were trying to figure out how to find a job or look after family members or attend university for the first time or have some semblance of a life. And when, from a faculty's position, they were juggling double and triple workloads, managing a full-time job while homeschooling children and caring for sick loved ones. And I know many faculty here can relate to that. And I'm sure the students who are listening can relate to some of the stresses and challenges of being a student at this time. So how do we begin to understand some of this intense emotion that people were feeling? Philosopher Rosie Berdotti notes how amidst the COVID crisis, many people describe cycling through these contradictory emotions, and she describes them as people spiking and troughing between overwhelm and exhaustion, boredom and panic. She sees this kind of emotional cycling as an intensification of what she calls the post-human convergence, or in other words, the contradictory alternation of emotions that she argues predated COVID. So she argues that, sort of these kind of swings between boredom and elation, or despair and boredom, predated COVID. And she kind of relates this to the period of time that she argues we're living in, which is a post-human period. And by post-humanism, she means a philosophical perspective that's trying to capture how people are living in this current moment globally. And it's one that decenters the human in the wake of our environmental and other crises. So whether we're talking about human rights and justice crises, the other pandemic that Ajay talked about, or we're talking about the environmental crises, post-humanism works to decenter the human. And rather than beginning from the assumptions that humans are on the top of a kind of evolutionary hierarchy of life, that we are kind of masters of all we survey, and that reason is going to be our way out of the difficult conditions that we find ourselves in. Post-humanism orients to human beings and human capacities as being no more less or less important or valuable than anything else in the world, than any other life form. Brodati describes these contradictory emotions as, and I quote, an intense sense of suffering alternating with hope, fear unfolding alongside resilience, boredom merging with vulnerability, excitement and exhilaration in view of advanced technologies. So post-humanism also thinks about the relationship between human beings and technologies. And so on the one moment, we can think about what technology gives us, what it offers and affords. And, there's no better example than the COVID-19 vaccines that have been developed. But we can also flip into anxiety and fear at the thought of the huge costs and damages inflicted by humans on both the human and non-human inhabitants of this planet. And all we have to do is think about the news this week and think about the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal to, think with Brodati here. So she argues that the Anthropocene, or the period of time in history, in the history of the Earth, where humans are having profound impacts on a planetary scale, influencing and altering the Earth's systems, she argues that this period of time has brought on these emotional extremes even before COVID. She argues that COVID has intensified them. And she goes on to suggest that while we might give in to despair, the despair side of the cycling of emotions that we might experience, or we might give over to the elation, we can also resist both of these pulls, refuse the either or. And, sort of echoing what Ajay said, rethink who we are and who we might be becoming as a species. She asks us to sit with the spikes and the troughs of emotion without smoothing them out, to hold on to hope even as we confront despair, to come closer to death as we work to sustain life. So instead of turning away from death and trying to hide death, that we confront death directly. And, with that, we also interrogate the systems that put certain people at greater risk of death, whether from the virus or other conditions. Concluding in her article that we can only intervene in this situation by acting collectively. But at the same time, she also makes very clear that we are not one and the same. We need to act collectively, but the we is all life on earth who are not one and the same, but are in this convergence together. What has been especially moving for me in running online workshops is observing how faculty and students come to express these contradictory affects in their story work. I'm going to show 3 stories from first-year students, asking you to attend to the emotions being expressed and some of the sources of these. And the first story by Marie is largely taking place at her desk and in her bedroom and on her bed. Second story by Carson is taking place around the University of Guelph, and he's a football player, so a lot of images we see are of football players in their football garb. And the final film is by Noor, and most of this story visually is about texting. So here goes.
Dear Diary, being a university student in quarantine can be really difficult. It has its easy days, which are rare, and harder days, which are most common. And I know that sounds really negative, and believe me, I'm all for positivity. But when you're basically trapped in your house all day doing assignment after assignment, days go by really slow, yet really fast. But let me elaborate on that. It's like when you're doing an assignment and you're on calls all day, it feels like the day goes by really slow. But when there's a due date coming up and you're not ready for it, it comes by really fast. Half of the time I feel like I'm missing most of the work, but that may just be because I have a serious procrastination problem. To describe a regular normal day would be I wake up, go straight to my laptop, check emails, texts, and let me just say that I'm in like 10,000 different groups for each of my classes, and that's not even including study groups. Anyway, I join a class or listen to a lecture at whatever time that may be, and right after class, I usually have a group call with members from my project groups to discuss any assignments we have to do together. Then, I eat for the first time of the day at like 4 p.m. because some days I just forget to. And then I stay up until 2 a.m. because I never think my day is over, have my regular mental breakdown, usual stuff. Then I go to sleep and repeat the whole cycle again. Trust me, I get it. I really don't like being such a downer. But I'm glad that I was able to take this time to rant about how I've been feeling. I cannot stress how much I look forward to finally being able to attend face-to-face classes and being on campus. That day cannot come by any faster. That's all for today, diary. To be continued. If I find the time, maybe. Dear Diary,
University wasn't even in the back of my head. I was simply going to go to college, become a power line technician. There's some of the reasons why we can actually meet online, use the internet, and electricity itself. If you don't know, I play football for the university. I never knew how much I loved football though, until I almost lost it. When I was in grade 12, we were pushing the sled in practice. My coach said when he blew the whistle, he wanted us to release off the sled, which didn't really work because there was a whole team on this sled, and that's not that safe. So I had to release through the inside of the sled. Well, when I released, I hit my Achilles. I couldn't play the next game because I couldn't walk, and it was the first time I had ever sat on the bench, and I hated it. See number 31 right there? I have mad props for the kid. He's in grade 10 playing with a bunch of grade 12s. There was a few kids that did that, and I have a mad props for them as well. Where were we? I was mad at my friends and just complete not talking to anybody. Really. I was so scared I would never be able to play football again. The next week, though, I was back on the field and happier than ever. During an injury timeout, 2 of my teammates and friends had been taken to the hospital in ambulances too. That's my brother. I'd never be playing football to this day if not for him. Two of the universities that came up were McMaster and Guelph. After the game, I had to think long and hard about if I was going to play university football. After I came and saw a game at Guelph, though, I knew what I was going to do. So, I went back in grade 12, got the marks that I needed, and in February of last year, I signed to play for the university. When the quarantine hit and our season was canceled, I was pretty upset because football is a big part of my decision to go to university. For the first time in 6 years, I won't be playing football this season, and it sucks, and it's making university even harder. So if you're asking what it's like being a first-year student during quarantine, well, I can tell you that it sucks being a student-athlete during COVID-19.
I'm coming home to you. Snowfall breaks the ground.
I feel overwhelmed, lost, and alone. I don't know where to go or what to do. I can't escape this house. All in my mind. I feel trapped.
I blame it on the cold daylight. Bring your arms around me, friend. Warm my bones and fill my glass. Girl, I hope this year's better than the last. A candle burns in the corner, held with a righteous hand. And I'm reminded of the silent night, all for a broken man. One I don't understand. I get tired around this time, but I will try to make things right.
Under pandemic conditions, like those described in these films, resilience has become a rallying cry of many experts. And, we can look to public health officials, we can look to senior people in our own institutions. Resilience has become, sort of this really important word that people have kind of latched onto and are, promoting. That these video makers have shown up to tell their experiences means that they have survived and they are adjusting, though their adjustments are obviously taxing and trying. In Carson's words, it sucks. Marie says it's a downer. And Nora talks about feeling overwhelmed and lost and alone. Yet what about folks who are not around to tell their stories? What about the stories we don't hear? Who's absented? Who is not present? And, those stories are stories that I'm really interested in. Resilience typically refers to an individual's or a system's adaptive capacities. So sometimes it's used to talk about the resilience of a certain kind of ecosystem. Sometimes resilience is used to talk about the capacity, the adaptive capacity of an individual. In psychology, it is described often as the ability to recover from some adversity and bounce back. While we assume that resilience is positive, some scholars caution against coding resilience as either entirely negative or entirely positive, approaching it instead as a dynamic in response to crises and shock that can only be appraised based on its effects. So sociologist Philippe Bourboux explains resilience is not always about positive adjustments. Shocks need not be inherently negative, and that the adjustments to them may not be necessarily positive. In some cases, being resilient might in fact mean being an obstacle to positive change. There might be good reasons for wanting to transform a social structure, a given situation, a regime, a norm, and that being resilient to these changes could be considered negative. So to me, the way that I interpret this quote is that perhaps resilience in some situations may operate more as rigidity than resilience, where we are not allowing ourselves to be touched by what is happening, where we are resisting the change that what is happening is inspiring or is causing to happen. So the pandemic, I think, gives us reasons to be worried about the push for resilience. On a societal level, ideals of individual level resilience pay little or no attention to the social, political, and environmental context of people's lives. So when resilience becomes individualized and seen as something you either possess or don't possess, then what gets erased is the context and the way the context might set you up to be able to manage a situation with resilience, or set you up to be quite vulnerable and exposed to a certain situation. So people's responses to this pandemic and to post-pandemic recovery are and will be affected by their access to the resources, the relationships, and the infrastructures that facilitate resilience. Is it reasonable, I would ask, to expect individuals to find ways to bounce back from a still ongoing crisis, regardless of their access to these things? We are not all the same. Remember that Brodati quote, we are in this together, but we are not all in the same place. We don't have the same access to resources. We don't have the same amount of power in the world. Should we be focusing on bouncing back, on recovering only, or should we also be taking a long, hard, and serious look at what problems have been exacerbated by COVID, which bodies and minds have been vulnerabilized, who has been made susceptible to death because of the pandemic? Should we be focusing on the changes that may be required in our social systems to reduce people's structural vulnerabilities and increase their survival and increase their access to life? Because COVID has exacerbated social, economic, and health inequities, those who have managed resilient responses have likely had better access to resources and supports than those who have not managed very well a resilient response, and I would suggest that the latter group have disproportionately faced exposure and with it, illness and death. And we are very, very differently impacted by this pandemic. A recent Maclean's article, this was dated November 12th, 2020, Dying for the Right to Live, details the excruciating life and death calculus that will face physicians if our hospitals become overwhelmed, who will have to determine who survives and who doesn't survive the pandemic. Which lives are deemed worth saving? White, non-disabled adults who are not too old and who have good jobs that have endured through the crisis have the greatest chances of survival. The old by which I mean folks who are over 75, over 80 years old, and certain groups of people with disabilities are rendered closer to death by the social organization of care, which in warehousing these folks in a for-profit system that devalues care work, dramatically increases disabled and aging people's vulnerability, leading to disproportionately higher death rates. So while there's no question that people have material vulnerabilities, we also have to address the ways that people become vulnerabilized through the organization of our social world. So I would argue that what we need is access to life for all, including access to income support, not-for-profit long-term care, expanded home and health care, and access to the social world for people with different kinds of disabilities for whom the social world was not built with those bodies and minds in mind. And also access to spaces and opportunities in allowing people to self-represent, to represent themselves, to tell their stories in ways that affirm the value and fullness of their lives. And so I'm going to end with a film made by a colleague of mine, Professor Patty Douglas. She's a faculty member at the University of, at Brandon University, and works closely with Revision. She was a postdoc at Revision, and she works a lot around issues of autism and traumatic brain injury. And she is confronting both the contradictory emotions and conditions that lie beneath COVID's impacts in this film. And when she made this film, she said she couldn't tell a narrative. She didn't have a story to tell. Remember, we were making these films in April, so it was right when the lockdown was beginning. And she said she had no words, so she spoke through her music, and she sat in her basement writing an original musical score and lyrics on her own, with no music gear other than her laptop. This is called Beneath the Surface. So I just want to end by saying that, I very much see the SOS project, the Stretching Our Stories project, as one step toward urgently needed new methods of everyday artistic expression involving folks whose stories have the power to expand and deepen our understanding of the diversity of experiences that people are having in these troubled times. And we urgently need these stories so that we can lend our voices to reshaping the world to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla. And wow, you really made me think about resilience and privilege, and I'm sure we'll unpack it more tonight. Thank you. And the videos were amazing. And maybe because usually Ryan starts with a question, but maybe before his question, just a small kind of little question about the student videos that we saw. Can you tell us a little bit about, because I have no idea, like what class it was, how many students, and what was the assignment, and maybe a little bit about what you think they learned through these videos and what you learned through these videos?
Well, this was a first-year seminar, and the professor was Dr. Morton, Mavis Morton. I don't know if you...
Oh, yes, she did talk about making videos. Oh, okay, yeah.
From her class.
And came to the class in the fall.
Yeah, that's it. And we lended our infrastructure and our skilled staff and facilitators to support the students in making these videos. So students were really learning about theory and practice of story making, storytelling. And they also learned about how to do audio, how to audio record, how to put together a film, how to edit. So really, it was a course on storytelling in its theory and in its practice. And I learned that it's hard. I learned about the difficulties and the challenges for students, especially in their first year, trying to enter university and create connections and feel their sense of belonging and a sense of place when everybody was, had to stay in place, where, folks could not come onto campus, where, sort of people's visions and dreams and plans and anticipations, sort of around what their first year experience was going to be, these students didn't have. These students will never have. They chose like very idiosyncratic, their own ways of telling those stories. So I just gave you a sampling of a few. And I learned about how difficult it was as well to be a student who's in a very different time zone. For students who, had to get up and work all night long, and sleep during the day. They have to, sort of live according to, sort of Eastern Standard Time clock, and how hard that was, and how hard it was, how much learning happens in just by being on campus, by interacting with your peers and your friends, and to try to recreate that experience, how challenging and difficult it is. So you hear Marie talking about, being in all of these groups to try to, in some ways, be a reasonable facsimile of what it means to be in place and to be, for sort of physically in an environment and to be absorbing, sort of learning, from everywhere, from your peers, in conversations when you're leaving class, when you go to the library, the posters that you see on the walls, sort of all the places where people are taking in new information, and that not being available to those students.
Wow. Yeah, it resonates with me because in this class we've learned, I think Ryan and I only see a small part, but we've learned so much from the students and their experience, either through the short weekly assignments or through emails we get from time to time. And I think really just blown away by what everybody's going through every week. Ryan, I see that you have your mic, you're on audio. It's your turn. So
I was just going to point out that that's a small question from Sophie. That let me just ask a small question about that.
Because then it doesn't count as a question.
I know that's what you meant. So I think so. First of all, two very, I think, powerful and very thought-provoking presentations. So first, just thank you for that, and I hope you'll extend a thank you to the students who created those videos too, because they do strike a chord, and I think many of us have really struggled. Not only, as you say, with kids are home and extra workload and all that, but also because we care about our students, and that really concerns us that they're going through these things and feeling a little bit powerless and how to alleviate some of that. So one thing that comes to mind, though, and through all of the discussion about there's this sort of really interesting contrast in terms of resilience being an important quality, and also being potentially problematic if it just represents inertia against positive change. On the other hand, uncertainty can be a real stressor, but as we've heard tonight, that if you're comfortable with uncertainty, if you're able to see it as a creative impetus, it can be really powerful in instigating those kinds of changes and innovations. And I think we've seen that throughout this semester with the way people stepped up and took on new projects and pivoted in their research and so on. So as I think about moving forward, I guess where I find myself kind of torn is in the difference between getting back to something that achieves the sorts of experiences you're mentioning, Carla, about being on campus and all that sort of stuff, and at the same time learning from what we went through and maybe trying to keep aspects that were more inclusive or more engaging or more connected in some ways. So this course, for example, we've got alumni from across the country and around the world that we couldn't have done that in a normal typical pre-COVID kind of setting. So where I'm kind of going with all this is as we're thinking about planning for next year for fall. I've noticed there's been a bit of a switch. So earlier in the pandemic, say last March kind of thing, the buzzwords were nimble and pivot. So you could have a bingo card for the number of times you heard the word nimble and pivot in a meeting. Those have been replaced now, and the new sort of cliche terms are robust and vibrant. And so I'm wondering, when you think about what the students have gone through and the things that are missing, but we also think about, is the right approach to kind of get back to the way it was before as soon as possible, and sometimes there are sort of feels like there's statements of certainty that really we can't be certain about yet. And my concern, one of my real concerns, is that we are going to forget a lot of the good stuff we came up with over the past year. So how do you see balancing the things that are giving back, the things that have been missing for students, for example, with also not just reverting back, not just being resilient in the bad sense of moving back to just as fast as we can to everything being like it was, because we know, like for a lot of people, it wasn't that great in many ways. So how do we balance those two things? And I guess I don't have an answer. So I'm wondering, you both have really kind of interesting perspectives on it. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I think that, and I'm just going to draw from Ajay's drawing from Arundhati Roy's quote. She talks about being in the portal. And I might describe that as being in the threshold, or being in the space where we're holding these difficult emotions and these difficult experiences, and we're not jumping to resolve them prematurely. That we're staying with the trouble, to quote Donna Haraway, and we are trying to work through, in ethical, just ways, our terms of being together as a collective. I don't want to see things just flip back into the way that they were. And, everybody's, so sick and tired of being shut up in their homes and not being able to do the things they've been able to do. Like, people are just exhausted. But there is a good reason to stay with the trouble. If we think about, sort of for whom this, sort of period of time has been absolutely devastating. And I don't like, in terms of students being on campus versus, online learning, I don't think it's going to move forward as an either or. I don't want it to move forward as an either or.
Agreed.
Disability justice perspective, we can make our teaching more accessible if we do blended models. I don't know how that is going to materialize. I don't know how I'm going to manage to lecture or to engage in critical discussions with some students who are face-to-face and some who are online. But I feel up for the challenge, because I'm committed to disability rights and disability justice, and because, many folks who are disabled, simply, can't make it into public spaces for a whole host of reasons. It's hard. The built environment is not built with everybody in mind. And so for me, we can have a bigger and more profound impact if we find ways of blending, our teaching and learning. And at the same time, I also want to say that I do think that learning is deeply embodied. It is emotional, it is embodied. And when we remove the body from learning, I think that we shortchange ourselves and we shortchange our students. So, my challenge over this past year is how to make learning embodied, even while we're in these boxes, or even while we're in these like digital spaces. And I think that art making and storytelling, I think those are ways that we can bring affect and emotion and the body into learning. And I don't think it matters what the discipline is or the subject matter is. I could go on and on about this too, in terms of, I'll stop there and turn it over to Ajay.
I think my simple answer can be summed up in 5 words. I agree with Carla Rice.
I should get that printed on a card.
That's a trick that my friend and colleague George Lipsitz always uses, and I love it.
Excellent.
But I think I do agree, and I think that when we imagine what a post-pandemic landscape is going to look like, I think we have to learn from the moment that we're living in. We can't go back to the old normal, whatever that was, right? Normal for whom, and I think, as I think about this from the point of view of being a festival organizer, Carla talked about, what it means in classrooms. I completely agree. But as a festival organizer, for example, I think if I were still running the jazz festival, even when we're able to go back to face-to-face concerts, I know that I would want to have a situation, or I would want to create opportunities for people, as you've said, in remote locations to be able to participate. We've been running events through our institute that have had tremendous participation and access for people that wouldn't be able to access the events otherwise. People all over the world. So yes, we've run into problems in our classes because of time zones and so on. But the flip side, of course, is that there's something very positive, that people have access to concerts, to materials, to classes that they might not be able to access otherwise. So I really believe that this is going to fundamentally change the way we do things, both in our classrooms and in our communities.
I think one thing that's really interesting, and I agree, I think it's probably, I'm going to get one that says I agree with Carla and Ajay, because I think that's probably going to...
I wonder how many words that is.
Yeah, it's probably maybe it's more than 5. But, one of the things that I've seen throughout the pandemic over the last year is that what's happened a lot is that we've taken traditional processes and tried to put them online. So we do a lot of things now with PDF forms, or we do a lot of things with scans of documents. They're not designed for the online medium. They're digitized versions of non-online processes. And so I think in the initial scramble last March, when we were sent home and had to finish out the semester, there was basically how much can we replicate what we were doing in class online. But I think we've had time, a little bit more time over this most recent semester, to kind of start thinking more about what can you do in this format that you couldn't do in another format. You wouldn't see Cocaleo, for one thing, because Sophie doesn't take him to class, right? So there's a lot of there are some aspects of personal connections and seeing, your professor's dog barking and their kid running by, and those sorts of connecting moments. Having people from different time zones be able to connect. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do if we aren't just trying to compare a digitized version of the old way, but rather thinking about how do we embrace what the technologies actually offer, and finding a good way to blend that sort of thing. And so that's what I kind of imagine too. And I wonder if you have just sort of a quick follow up to that on the student experiences, or the artist's experiences, or what have you, in navigating that. Like you Carla, to start with, you mentioned, you called it experimenting with online. And I use that word a lot in my course too. This is an experiment. We're trying this. We're going to see how it goes. And I found the students responded pretty well to that. Like if you said, look, I don't know how this is going to turn out. We're trying it, we're along for the ride too. And I felt like we actually changed a lot of things that we wouldn't have changed in a normal period. And have you seen that the students that you've worked with, or the faculty you've worked with, or the artists you've worked with, have had that sense that once you kind of embrace the idea that everything is so disrupted, you can kind of try anything you want, that it felt kind of liberating to me in my course. And I'm wondering if the students respond in the same way, that it's a good thing that we're like, you know what, we're just trying this out, basically. Is there a positive side to that uncertainty?
I would say yes, absolutely. There is something freeing about all of the conventions and all of the norms being thrown out the window, and we have to construct something new here and now. I love it. I relish it. It does free up our ability to try things and fail. Like there's, when there are no norms and no conventions, then, there are no, visions of what success looks like either. So it's easier to fail. There's more space for failure. You're allowed to fail because you're trying things out. I would also, sort of point you back to Patty's film. In the film, you have to watch it a few times to kind of see this, but she's using headlines from newspapers, and some of them are from disabled artists who are talking about moving to the online space, but saying things like, been there, done that. So this is where, disability community is in a leading role. Sort of where people within disability communities are very, very used to live streaming, are very used to meeting in online spaces and, making together in online spaces, doing things, sharing in online spaces, because of the inaccessibility of many material spaces in our world. So I see this as a moment where folks with disabilities, and where the disability community and disability activists and artists are, in a way, leading the way. So I think that's all I'm going to say on that.
Thank you.
Right. Did you want to add anything to that? Or maybe I'll let Sophie ask a question. I snuck two in there. I felt like that was fair play.
Yeah, we are cheaters. So I will say, just like, because earlier up there was Samantha who talked about unprecedented was her bingo word. I'm just gonna admit to it. We've actually had a bingo card with those words on.
Senate bingo.
In one instance, but we have played bingo on those words. I will try. I want to pick up on the question from Catherine. I think it's mostly for you, Ajay. who talked about these phrases, there's no playbook for this, and we're building the plane as we're flying it. They've been used so often during the pandemic. And Catherine asks, while true, perhaps the lack of a prescriptive plan has allowed for more improvisation and innovation in response. And I do want to ask, building on Catherine, how good do you, like when you're looking at the last year, how good do you think our leaders have been at improvising? And a sub question is, I'm like, it was so interesting to hear you from the perspective of me as a middle manager, but how much is there in improvisation studies, how much is there about improvisation and leadership, and how much it can teach leaders and how much it can teach managers? I'm guessing this is a subfield of your discipline. And then improvisation and education, and how much is there? So I don't know if you want to give us a brief one, and then to talk about maybe, do you think there's an opportunity for improvisation studies during this moment? Because I had not thought about this until I heard you tonight, and it just really blew my mind to hear you. So I'm kind of curious about what you think is next for improvisation studies.
Thank you, Sophie. There's a lot in that question.
Yeah, well, that's not a small question. I didn't say it was small this time. That's just a normal size question.
No, they're great questions. So if I can unpack them, there's a question about how our leaders are currently improvising and what we make of that, which is itself a very complicated question. There's a question about improvisation studies and where it's going, and a question about the sub-discipline of improvisation in relation to management theory. So maybe I could start there. So there is, in fact, a wide body of literature that uses improvisation as a model for thinking through theories of management and business. I find it very problematic because it is about the interest that, as you probably gathered from my little talk today, the work that I do on improvisation is all about the way in which aggrieved communities, and I take as my model experimental Black musicians from the United States in particular, who've worked with creative improvised music and jazz. I'm interested in the ways that aggrieved populations have used improvised creative practices to sound off against systems of oppression and fixity, right? Creating a way out of no way. So using the tools and resources available to you in the arenas that are open to you in order to make positive things transpire that wouldn't have transpired otherwise. And there's a long history of this within the context of African-American creative practice. So that's what interests me, and that's the work that I'm doing. Now, when improvisation theory is taken up by management and business people, it tends to be about how we can train business managers to use improvisation to make more profit, how we can teach corporations to make more profit. So, you know, how do you take theories of improvisation and convince people at Shell that they can use these structures of improv to, you know, build more systems of profit for their shareholders, which I find very much at odds with the contexts that I'm interested in for improvisation. So that's just, you know, a whole other thing. And a number of people through our institute have looked at some of that theory. There's a special issue of our journal, Critical Studies in Improvisation, that talks about some of that theory. There's an interview with Joel Bakken, who's one of our research team members. Joel is the author of The Corporation, the movie and the film, and more recently, The New Corporation, the movie and the film, or sorry, the movie and the book. There's an interview with him about this in the journal. But, you know, my sense is that much of the literature that looks at improvisation in that context of management theory is pretty problematic, at least in terms of where I'm coming from. Now, having said that, there is also, I think, a really interesting body of literature that is starting to come out from people who are in positions of power in governments, who are thinking about improvisation in terms of policy. So one of the people on our team is actually the current Minister of Justice, David Lametti, the Attorney General of Canada. who has done work on improvisation as part of our research team. It's something he thinks about. It's something that, he's written a policy paper for us on improvisation in relation to intellectual property policy, which is one of his areas as a law professor before he was a politician. So there's also a mayor of a city in the US who has talked about how he's used our work on improvisation in much of the work we've done in our books, and it's inspired his approach to governing his city. So I think there are positive models, but I would be cautious, I think, which leads me to the question about how our leaders are doing. Improvisation is not always good, I guess is what I would say. And this is something I've learned, again, through my years of being the artistic director of the Guelph Jazz Festival. As much as I want to hang on to a model of improvisation that is all about resistance, that's all about creativity, that's all about listening, all those good things that I often talk about, kind of this utopian model of improvisation that I do believe in. I do believe that when musicians improvise, they can create wondrous things. And I believe that there's a lesson for us about how best we can get along in a globalized world that's being encapsulated in miniature in that moment when musicians come together to improvise. But it doesn't always work, and I think we need to admit it. So the flip side of this is that, Donald Trump is an improviser, but he's not a good improviser, at least not in my mind. Doug Ford is, I think, probably an improviser, but I don't think he's improvising very well in the situations that we're dealing with. I would say that a good improviser is one who is adept at listening to and responding to the situations in which he or she finds himself or herself. Like what's happening in that moment, and really listening to what's going on around you is critical to being a good improviser, right? So I think that yes, some of our elected politicians are improvising in this moment, but I don't think many of them are improvising well. There probably are some, like maybe in Iceland, for example, or in New Zealand. They're doing it in New Zealand, like she's amazing, right? But in Canada, I don't know. I don't think that I've seen many examples of our elected officials who are improvising well to the pandemic. At least that's my reading.
I wonder too if people might confuse being reactive to, what you would probably, I'm guessing, describe a difference between reacting and being creatively improvisational or leading on that edge versus responding to having something happen. And I see there seems to be a lot of reactive kind of. It seems like they're making it up as they go along, but they're always kind of one step behind whatever's happening. So I had a question actually that I think will follow fairly well from that, which is there's a lot of value, I think, that we've seen tonight in being able to improvise and all the things that means. So being comfortable with uncertainty, thinking and acting quickly, going with the flow. This idea used of some really interesting quotes, Ajay, about being flexible disposition towards reality was one, and engage with ongoing states of precarity, which I thought was a really great way of putting it. Carla, as you mentioned, the sort of freedom to fail. I think you give yourself more leeway to experience. Your expectations and demands on yourself are lower if you realize I'm making this up and I'm trying this out and so on. So we see we're kind of forced in many ways to do that in a crisis like this. But are there ways that would be effective for people to gain that experience in a safer kind of environment? So I'm thinking, is there value in doing improvisational music or doing improvisational theater or, creative writing that's sort of on the fly? Are there ways to build your skill set in improvisation that would translate to a good form of resilience, I guess you could say, under crisis conditions? So in other words, a way of thinking creatively and handling uncertainty and being able to adjust quickly and those sorts of things. Can you learn that skill? Can you develop that skill?
Yes.
I see you by the smile, Carla. I'm going to guess that the answer is probably yes, but
Absolutely. I mean, some of people's strongest writing in our creative writing workshops are when we do automatic writing, which is you put your pen to paper and you're given a prompt or a theme and you write for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, however long it is. And you don't take your pen from paper. Even if you're writing, this is stupid, this is dumb, I don't know what to say for the first 5 of those 10 minutes, you just continue doing it. And inevitably, maybe not in every case, but in many cases in workshops I've been in, really interesting stuff comes.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think a lot of the work that we do at our institute is essentially testing that hypothesis that there's something that's going on when musicians improvise that can apply to other spheres of influence and action. So I've mentioned, that we have lawyers on our research team. We have a physician on our research team. The head of surgery at Women's College Hospital is a member of our research team who's talked about how he himself is an improviser, right? And I feel that a lot of the projects we do with our community partners are a way of testing that hypothesis. So yes, I think that the short answer is absolutely. I firmly believe that there's something very powerful that can be learned from those artistic examples that can be applied to other spheres of influence and action.
I really like the idea that it's not just developing your quick, thinking on your feet or what have you. It's about letting go, becoming comfortable not being in control of a situation. I think is really important. A lot of us, I think, have experienced. It's just been, this past year has been so disruptive in every sphere that you just can't, if you're trying to cling on to certainty and retaining control, it just isn't possible. So I think there's a lot of value in that angle of it, which I hadn't thought of maybe before, but you've kind of made me realize is that, doing those things where you free yourself to experiment, you're allowed to make mistakes and that's part of it. And that there's some, you're not comfortable with uncertainty necessarily, but you're comfortable with being able to explore within the realm of uncertainty. I think is a really interesting lesson that I hope students are kind of listening to. And part of how we're going to make things better as we go is that people are trying stuff they wouldn't have tried, for example, otherwise, and so on. So that's a really, really valuable lesson that I've taken from tonight in any case. Did you want to say something, Carla?
Yeah, I want to say that that also there's a paradox within that is a fine paradox to hold, which is, sort of you can do that from a place of knowing. You can move into the uncertainty when you have a certain kind of comfort with what you know. Like I can go into a classroom and I can, sort of teach in an improvisational kind of way, because I'm comfortable with my pedagogy, because I can rely on myself to manage or handle or respond to or be with the situations that emerge within the classroom. And I think that's harder to do when you're new in a field. So I'm Ajay's talking about surgery at Women's College Hospital, and I wonder if the junior surgeon who's can accomplish that, or if that's something that comes with having like a depth and breadth of experience.
Just as we're talking about doctors and surgery, I need to tell a personal story. It's about improvisation, and some of you will know this, but I had a heart attack on a flight. An out-of-the-blue heart attack while coming home from a conference in Paris. And the person who saved my life turns out to have been a physician, and he was improvising. And he basically created an impromptu life-saving team and saved my life on board a flight. And amazing story, I have stayed in touch with this person after he saved my life. And I sent him a copy of one of my books, which was published soon after this incident. And on the front cover of the book is a photograph of two relatively obscure African-American musicians. And he wrote to me and said, I know this musician. His mother and my mother are good friends. And then he said, and in the thank you notes, I say, thank you to Dr. Schnell for improvising a quiet miracle. And he said, I was improvising in that moment. And, you know, this happens. And it occurred to me that you want your surgeon to be able to improvise. You don't want, I mean, this is what happens, right? You can't always play by the textbook. It's not always going to work out the way you want it to. So yeah, just a sort of personal anecdote that that brought to mind. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is that to be a good improviser, you need to realize that improvisation doesn't just come out of nowhere. It is a learned skill, right? To be able to, I mean, it's kind of what Carla said. Carla can go into her class and improvise because she's good at it and she's trained. Similarly, you know, a good musician, a good improvising musician has spent years practicing the craft. So it's a myth to say that improvisation is just happening in the moment. There's years, I mean, especially within the context of the kind of African-American creative practices that interest me, it's about reclaiming certain kinds of histories that have been whitewashed. And it's absolutely essential that those histories are seen as part of what's going on in the here and now. So again, there's a kind of myth that it's just taking place now and there's nothing previous that's lending itself to the expression of what's going on in the moment. But again, many musicians would say, no, it's not about that at all. It's a learned art, and it involves a great deal of, in fact, it's about the recovery of marginalized histories. So anyway, just a bit more.
No, those are two excellent points, and I think there's another important lesson there, which is that it involves trusting yourself and your abilities and your knowledge and your experience that allows you to kind of do that. Just a really quick story that you made me think of, Carla, that sometimes people ask, like, do you get nervous when you're teaching and so on? And I said, not so much anymore because, you know, you've done so much. But there's one event that really kind of changed it for me. Was I was giving a talk, and it was somewhere, it was in Texas, I think, and they said, you know, the graduate students have this, they meet beforehand, and could you come to that course and, you know, just be there and talk to the students? I'm like, sure. So I get there and I'm waiting for whoever teaches this course to show up, and I said, so where's the prof who teaches this course? No, it's you. So they basically wanted me to come and do an impromptu class. Like it wasn't just be there and answer questions. So I said, okay, what are you guys covering right now? And they said, well, this and that. I said, fine. So I just started doing, and I realized that after that one, it's like, I can wing it if I have to, right? And again, it's not because I can make stuff up. It's because I have enough that I can draw on, that I can do it if I have to. So now, you know, Sophie and I talk, sometimes we're giving a presentation or something, and I'm like, yeah, I'm you know, I feel like I know what I'm going to do. It's fine. I don't need to kind of review it too much. And that moment stuck out. Like that was pretty early in my career, but it made me trust myself that if my slides don't work, or if whatever happens, or there's some disruption, or I, you know, go off on a tangent that isn't, you know, what I was originally planning, it's fine. I can do that. So that is totally about confidence. And you see it with, you know, improv comedians and stuff. You know that they've got this repertoire that they can draw from. So that's a really important point too, is that it's a way of building trust in your own abilities, I guess, when you put yourself out like that. So that's another really important thing, I think, to sort of have the students recognize that also doesn't come from nowhere. You know, if you've got a prof who's pretty good at engaging with the class, that didn't just come from no place, right? That's really great to hear that. Sophie, I think we probably sneak one more in if you wanted to.
I don't know, like we're at 3 minutes till the end and we need to talk about next week's panel, so I'm not. I love this thing about creativity, like improvisation, and that moment of improvisation that, you know, it can lead to trust, it can lead to like building trust in oneself, it can lead to creativity, it can lead to so many things. But I think we have to talk about next week's panels.
Yes, and really, actually, the topic that we came up with follows very nicely.
It follows so well. But first, we need to really thank Ajay and Carla. You
great. It's so good.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was awesome. What an awesome night with awesome presentations and discussions. And I have so many things that I wanted to pick up, and I knew we wouldn't have too much time. This was awesome. So, but Colin, do you want to put the slide on for next week? Brian, do you want to speak about it?
Sure, I can do that. So, yeah, first let me echo the thank yous. This was really, really interesting and thought-provoking, and So I come at it from the science side of things, but I see so many parallels with what you're talking about in terms of how we operate and doing creative science too. So this is a lot to kind of digest. Thank you very much. So the reason I say this follows nicely for next week is what we decided to focus on as the topic was some of the things that have come up sort of repeatedly as themes, which is the idea of accessibility and inclusion during this experience. So we're calling next week's COVID-19 and Accessibility, a year at the University of Guelph. And we've got a really special lineup for next week. So we've got Barry Prasma-Townsend, who is a major player in the manager in the Student Accessibility Services. And we had some really interesting discussions with him about some of these aspects of how do we keep some of the lessons we've learned, some of the innovations we've made that have made things more accessible for students. How do we maintain those as we move forward? We also are going to have two students speaking with us, Caitlin Beacock and Mitchell Martow, who, Mitchell at least I believe is a student in the course.
Yeah, Mitchell is in the course.
Mm-hmm. So we'll be talking about accessibility issues and so on. There he is right there. Hi, Mitch. We're going to be really glad to hear from you.
Awesome. You're here tonight, guys.
Yep. And Leslie Chisholm, who's here, you'll see her as Leslie C in the chat.
Yeah, Leslie
She'll be
C.
joining us from sunny Australia. And Sherry Hinks, and Sherry mentioned this to me actually as well. Sherry Hinks is an instructor in my department and has come up with some really creative ways of engaging students to allow them to basically do field projects that we would normally do in person at home by sending out kits and all this sort of interesting stuff. And speaking of small world, Sherry, when we mentioned that you, Leslie, when we mentioned that to Sherry that you were going to be taking part, she said, oh yeah, we were in school together. So again,
yeah, Leslie just realized it too.
Yeah, small world. So next week, I hope you'll be able to join us. We're going to be talking about some really important topics, and that'll be the last class of the semester. So we'll be wrapping up and reflecting a little bit on how things have gone. As always, if you have any questions, you can use the discussion forum on CourseLink. You can ask your TAs at your seminars, or you can use the course email, UNIV2020@uguelph.ca. So again, thanks everyone for being here. Ajay and Carla, thank you so much for everything tonight. This was just wonderful. And I hope everyone stays well, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, this was amazing. Thank you both of you, and thank you for everyone in the audience and the chat as usual, and see everyone next week for our last panel of the entire year.
Yeah.
And the class. So thank you, everyone.
Don't get sad yet. It's going to be a very interesting panel.
Yes.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.